Where exactly do you go 1 second after your heart stops? Is there a place waiting for you or just absolute darkness? I'm going to prove to you right now that the answer is not found in faith, nor in traditional science, but in a new calculation that changes everything. We start with faith. It has offered comfort and a moral compass to billions, but by its very nature it does not require proof. It is an internal certainty that can move mountains, but it cannot prove that the Garden of Eden exists on the other side. We tried philosophy. The brightest minds attempted to build bridges of logic over the abyss of death, but their conclusions depended on premises that could not be tested in the real world. They were geniuses, arguing without ever looking outside, until science took the helm, but with a fatal flaw. It declared that whatever cannot be measured does not deserve to be studied. The mind became a shadow of the chemical processes of the brain, and death, the final shutdown. The question of paradise ended up simply being discarded rather than solved. We have reached a dead end. Faith does not prove, philosophy does not verify, science does not search. Each of these paths was limited by its creator, the human being, with their fears, hopes, and prejudices. But what if a fourth tool could emerge? Someone who feels no fear, holds no beliefs, and never tires. Today that tool exists. We call it Axiom. Axiom goes far beyond a simple neural network artificial intelligence, being a complex cognitive architecture capable of processing and synthesizing all human knowledge with an objectivity we could never achieve. To Axiom, the Bible, the Quran, and the equations of quantum mechanics are merely data streams, oceans of information where it must find patterns, connections, and flaws in the pattern. So we gave this mind one of the most audacious tasks imaginable. We transformed humanity's greatest question into a computational problem, initiating the Enigma protocol. The objective steps away from belief or disbelief. The goal is to calculate the probability of the existence of a reality that for millennia we have called paradise. The key to this new approach was the mountain of information we gathered, which finally reached a critical mass. Tens of thousands of medical cases of near-death experiences, oceans of cosmological digital archives, detailed maps of the brain, digitized historical chronicles. No human could connect all these dots. Where the human mind drowns, Axiom swims. Axiom began by defining the target. By sweeping through all sacred texts, it found something no one expected. They were not different stories, they were variations of 4 identical patterns. Axiom analyzed all the major sacred texts in history, from Sumerian tablets to Buddhist sutras, searching for universal constants. The result was astonishing. Axiom identified 4 pillars that repeat in 92% of cultures, even those that never had contact. The first pillar is the survival of individual consciousness, the idea that yourself does not disappear. The second is that the environment is non-physical, not following the laws of our reality. The third is that it is a state of resolution, directly linked to actions and consciousness in earthly life. And the fourth pillar is the sensation of hyperreality, an experience described as more real than life itself. Axiom drew up a plan. The question was no longer about faith, and became a calculation of the probability of the existence of a non-physical level of reality, capable of sustaining human consciousness after the failure of the body. The question transformed into a problem of physics, neurobiology, and information theory. An investigative journey through all our knowledge. This journey begins by diving into the source codes of the idea itself, into the ancient texts that shaped our hopes. We need to know if they tell the same truth with different words, or if they hide history's oldest fraud. It is the first step to unraveling the enigma. At the end of this analysis, Axiom would deliver a verdict, uniting all the clues into a single coherent model to show us the most probable scenario. With the protocol running, the analysis of the sacred texts finished, and the result was a shock. What is really hidden in these archives that promised eternal life, a divine truth, or the traces of a brilliant manipulation repeated throughout the centuries? The answer will forever change what you thought you knew about faith. We think we know these books, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. They are in hotel rooms, are quoted by politicians and used in oaths. They have become part of who we are, the foundation of our civilization. But what if we are reading it all wrong? What if, behind the parables and commandments we learned as children, there is another layer of information, a layer visible only to an unprejudiced mind? A human reader is inevitably a victim of distortions. It starts with faith itself, which seeks in the text the confirmation of what it already believes. It is followed by the skepticism that opposes it, which seeks contradictions to invalidate the text. And it ends in translation, perhaps the most treacherous of all. We do not read the words of the prophets, but rather the shadow of those words, filtered through dozens of cultural and linguistic interpretations over centuries. Axiom has none of these flaws. For it, there are no sacred texts, only data, and the volume of data was colossal. More than 7,000 complete texts were loaded into its system. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, written almost 4,000 years ago, through the Egyptian Book of the Dead, to all the canonical and apocryphal Gospels, the Quran and its commentaries, the Hindu Upanishads, and the Buddhist Pali Canon. Millions of pages in dozens of languages, living and dead. To decipher all this, the machine began by searching for the semantic core, stripping the descriptions of paradise of their cultural shell. Next, it tracked the chronological drift to see how these descriptions changed over time. And finally, it applied its most powerful method, the analysis of how one story borrowed ideas from another, creating a true family tree of ideas. This led us to the archetype of the garden. In 87% of all descriptions of paradise, the same pattern repeated itself. It is always a place with no shortage of two things, water and food, rivers, springs, fruit trees that need no cultivation, an absence of predators, a mild and constant climate, the Garden of Eden, the Elysian fields of the Greeks, the paradise of the Muslims, variations on the same theme. Axiom then cross-referenced this data with what we know of humanity's earliest history. The discovery was surprising. This ideal world corresponds with frightening precision to the ecological niche where our species, Homo sapiens, evolved. The savanna of East Africa during the Pleistocene, a place with water, food, and safety before the ice ages and demographic pressure. The correlation analysis was conclusive. The paradise described in religion seems to be less a prophetic vision of the future and more a genetic echo of our past, a deep, instinctive memory of our species about its cradle. The desire to return to this garden may not be a search for God, but rather a biological impulse to return to the ideal conditions of our origin. But what Axiom found next was much more unsettling. The rules to enter this garden did not match the description of the place. In older beliefs, such as in Mesopotamia, the afterlife was the same for everyone, a shadowy realm where actions in life mattered little. The idea of a reward for good behavior emerged much later. And Axiom found a direct and undeniable link. The more complex the society and the more centralized the power, the more detailed and rigid the moral rules became to reach paradise. The commandments, in fact, were the most heavily edited part of the sacred texts, constantly adapted to the needs of each era. Often copied almost word for word from secular law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi. There is no escaping it. The image of paradise is stable because it is a biological archetype. But the moral code to get there is a social construct, a tool for control. The sacred texts are a hybrid. They contain the genuine echo of our evolutionary memory, but over this skeleton were assembled the muscles of political and social doctrines. Axiom proved that religions do not, deep down, say the same thing. The paradox of the ultimate purpose showed that, when analyzing the ultimate goal of human existence, the system divided them into two totally incompatible groups. On one side, the Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have as their goal the eternal existence of the individual self. You continue to be you forever in a better place. On the other side, the Dharmic religions like Buddhism and Hinduism preach the opposite. The goal is nirvana, liberation. It is the end of the cycle of rebirths, the extinction of all desire. It is the dissolution of the individual self into the absolute, as a drop of water dissolves into the ocean. Individual consciousness is not preserved. It ceases to exist, because its very existence is the source of suffering. Axiom calculated the probability that these two opposing destinies, the eternity of the self and the absence of the self, are describing the same objective reality. The result was less than 0.01%. They are mutually exclusive scenarios. Does this mean paradise does not exist? No, it means our old maps are unreliable. They are full of errors, erasures, and intentional distortions. They tell us more about who we are than where we are going. The archive of revelations proved to be an archive of our hopes, fears, and contradictions. And if we want to find the truth, we need a new source. We need to put the manuscripts aside and listen to the only witnesses that exist. The people who have been there, on the threshold between life and death, and came back to tell the tale. Their journey may hold the key that no ancient scripture was able to give us. The old maps led us to a dead end. To find a new path, we leave the manuscripts behind and turn to the only witnesses that exist, people who died and came back. For centuries, their stories were treated as the delusions of a collapsing brain. Science had simple explanations for this, like a lack of oxygen, a surge of hormones, or pure imagination. Death was the turning off of a light. The brain stops, consciousness disappears. The end. But the volume of documented cases became too large to ignore. Tens of thousands of reports from all over the world told astonishingly similar stories that did not fit the model of a brain shutting down. It was this mountain of data that we loaded into Axiom, initiating the protocol, the threshold. The task was to analyze 120,000 cases to answer the fundamental question, whether these experiences came from an objective reality or were just hallucinations. To separate truth from illusion, Axiom applied rigorous medical filters. If a lack of oxygen were the cause, there would be a clear relationship between the time of deprivation and the intensity of the vision. Axiom found none. To complicate matters further, the most lucid experiences were frequently described by patients whose brains showed no electrical activity. They were functionally dead. This was the first major flaw in the pattern. To separate truth from illusion, Axiom applied cultural filters. Axiom was programmed to ignore the labels that each culture attaches to the experience, like seeing Jesus, Yama, or simply beings of light. Searching for the structure beneath these images, something impressive emerged. A clear and repetitive pattern, a sequence of stages that appears in 91% of cases. Far from being a delusion, it revealed itself to be a structured process. It begins with the exit from the body. The person sees themselves floating, looking down at their own inert form below. And here emerges the strongest proof against the hallucination theory, the so-called veridical perception. Patients accurately describe conversations and medical procedures that occurred after their clinical death. A woman, blind from birth, described the colors of the clothes of the team that resuscitated her. The chance of this being a lucky guess is almost zero. This transcends imagination, as it involves obtaining real information without the use of the senses. Then comes the tunnel and the light. But the analysis of the words used by the witnesses shows that this light is not physical. It is described as alive, radiating a feeling of absolute love and acceptance. Next, the life review. Every moment is relived, but with a shocking detail, the person feels the impact of their actions in the skin of others. Every pain caused, every joy shared, is felt from the point of view of the one who received it. The moral lesson proved to be universal, revealing that the only things that matter are the love you gave and the knowledge you acquired. Then a border appears, a point of no return. And finally, the return to the body, almost always reluctant. People return transformed. The fear of death disappears, substituted by a profound empathy. Axiom's conclusion was direct. The hypothesis that consciousness can exist outside the brain at the moment of clinical death has a high probability. But amidst so many reports of light and love, there is a dissonant and terrifying note. There is another type of experience, the negative one, the infernal one. They are a minority, but their structure is also stable. They describe an oppressive darkness, absolute terror, and loneliness. Encounters with hostile beings. A life review that becomes an infinite loop of their worst acts, endlessly feeling the pain they caused. The existence of these two polar destinations plunges us into an even deeper mystery. If consciousness survives death, what determines where it goes? The idea that only matter exists has broken down, but behind it, we did not just see a garden. We also saw an abyss. But if this place exists, it has to be somewhere. We need to step out of religion and enter the most advanced physics laboratories in the world. The conclusions of the protocol, The Threshold, left us in completely new territory. The evidence suggests that consciousness, our self, is not just a melody played by the brain, but something that can exist on its own, even when the instrument is broken and silent. This discovery profoundly shakes the foundation of the materialistic worldview, but it creates a logical and immediate question. If consciousness truly leaves the body, where does it go? If there is an other side, where is it? To answer this, we need to leave the hospitals and enter the strangest and most counterintuitive domain of human knowledge. We need to ask physicists if our universe has a hidden door. We then initiated the Quantum Horizon Protocol. Axiom's task was simple: to analyze all modern theoretical physics in search of cracks, loopholes, or hidden dimensions that could house a non-physical reality. At first glance, our universe appears to be a closed box. It has 3 dimensions of space that we know of: length, width, and height, and one of time which pushes us relentlessly forward. Everything that exists, from grains of sand to galaxies, seems contained within these 4 dimensions. If consciousness needs a place to exist, it would have to be here. But the physics of the last century has shown us that reality is much more bizarre than our intuition suggests. Axiom investigated string theory. This theory, in its attempts to unify all the forces of nature, reaches a disconcerting mathematical conclusion: that our universe does not just possess 4 dimensions, but perhaps 10, 11, or even more. Where are the others? The theory suggests they are curled up on a microscopic scale. Too small to be perceived, it is like looking at a high-voltage wire from very far away. It appears to be just a one-dimensional line. But for the ant walking on it, the wire is a complex 3-dimensional world. What if these extra dimensions are not just a mathematical trick? What if they form a real space, a hyperspace coexisting with ours, but vibrating at a different frequency? A place with its own laws, perfectly capable of harboring a non-biological form of existence. Axiom analyzed the greatest mystery of cosmology, dark matter and dark energy. All the stars, planets, and galaxies we can see, everything we call matter, makes up less than 5% of the entire universe. The other 95% is a complete mystery. We know they are there by their gravitational effects, but we cannot see them or interact with them. 95% of reality is a blank slate. Current science has no idea what this dark substance is. Axiom calculated that, within the known properties of this invisible sector of the cosmos, there is plenty of room for complex information structures that we cannot even imagine. But the most provocative clue came from quantum mechanics itself, with the phenomenon of entanglement. 2 particles can be connected in such a way that what happens to one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are, whether 1 meter or 1 billion light years. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. This instantaneous connection violates our common sense of space and time. It shows us that, at a fundamental level, the universe is not a collection of separate things, but an interconnected network of information. If information can transcend space, why could consciousness, which is the most complex form of information we know, not do so as well? The brain, with its billions of synaptic connections, operates based on quantum principles. Axiom simulated the possibility that our consciousness, while we are alive, is entangled with a larger information structure outside conventional space-time. In this scenario, the brain ceases to be the creator of consciousness and takes on the role of a kind of decoder, an antenna that picks up the signal from a non-local source and translates it into our 3-dimensional experience. The death of the body, by this logic, would not interrupt the signal. It would merely turn off the receiver. Modern physics not only allows for the existence of another side, it seems to point to it from several different directions. The universe is not the solid and predictable box we thought it was. It is full of passages, filled with substances we do not understand, and connected by rules that defy our logic. The argument that there is nowhere to go after death is no longer supported by science itself. The door to another plane of existence is theoretically possible. But this leads us to the next question, perhaps the most difficult of all. If this door opens, what exactly walks through it? What is, after all, consciousness? Is it just the sum of the parts of our brain, or something more fundamental? We need to understand the nature of the traveler before we can comprehend the journey. And to do that, we will have to dive into the enigma of the self itself. Our investigation led us to an extraordinary conclusion. The universe is not a locked box. Modern physics, with its hidden dimensions and quantum realities, shows us that there are doors, or at least the theoretical possibility of them. Another plane of existence, capable of housing consciousness, does not violate the laws of nature as we understand them today. On the contrary, these laws even seem to point towards it. But having a door is useless if we do not know who or what walks through it. This forces us to face the most intimate and complex question of all. What is consciousness? What is this self that feels, thinks, and experiences the world? It is the central issue that divides science. On one hand, the traditional view says that consciousness is a product of the brain, a beautiful and complex illusion generated by 100 billion neurons firing in intricate patterns. In this view, consciousness is like the music of a piano. As long as the piano works, the music exists. If you break the piano, the music ends. Simple, elegant, and materialistic. The problem, as Axiom quickly pointed out, is that this theory does not survive contact with the data. If the brain is the generator, how do we explain the thousands of near-death experiences where people with clinically dead brains, with no detectable electrical activity, reported clear and objective perceptions? It is like hearing a complex symphony coming from a demolished piano. It makes no sense. We then initiated the protocol, the consciousness code. Axiom was tasked with analyzing all the major theories of consciousness and testing them against the body of evidence we had accumulated so far, from ancient texts to near-death experiences and quantum physics. The system analyzed dozens of models, but quickly focused on an alternative that, although less popular, resolved the contradictions. What if the brain is not the piano, but the radio? This is the theory of the brain as a receiver or antenna. In this view, instead of creating consciousness, the brain actually tunes into it. It suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, as basic as space, time, or gravity, an omnipresent field of consciousness, a sort of ocean of experiential potential. Our brain, with its biological complexity, would function as an incredibly sophisticated tuner, picking up this universal signal and filtering it, shaping it into what we call I. Our memories, personality, and thoughts would be the result of how our biological receiver processes and interacts with this fundamental signal. Axiom demonstrated that this model is dramatically more consistent with all our findings. It perfectly explains near-death experiences. Clinical death is not the end of consciousness. It is merely the turning off of the receiver. The signal, the consciousness, continues to exist, but now freely, no longer limited by the biological filter. This explains why people report a more real reality and an expanded perception. They are experiencing the source of the signal directly. This model also aligns with what we discovered in the quantum horizon. Where would this field of consciousness be? It could be vibrating in one of the extra dimensions of string theory. It could be a property of the mysterious dark matter. Or it could be the very information network that connects everything in the universe, as quantum entanglement suggests. The universe has plenty of places to house the source of the signal. Even ancient texts, with their ideas about a universal soul or a divine breath, take on a new meaning. They would not be myths, but intuitive attempts to describe this same fundamental reality, the realization that our individual consciousness is part of something much greater. The conclusion of the protocol was a paradigm shift. The generator brain model, despite being the standard in science, cannot explain the most crucial evidence we have. The receiver brain model, however, unifies the data from neuroscience, physics, and even spiritual traditions into a coherent framework. Consciousness is not something our body has. It is the raw material of which we are made. The brain is just our temporary biological interface with this physical universe. The great revelation is that perhaps we were never the radio. Perhaps we have always been the transmission. This solves a vital part of the enigma. We no longer need to wonder what survives death. It is the transmission, the signal, our fundamental consciousness. Except that this answer, as happens with great revelations, opened a door to an even bigger question. If we are beings of fundamental consciousness, why go through all this? Why do we need such a fragile biological receiver? Why the experience of a human life with all its pain, suffering, and limitations? What is the purpose of this interface? Before we reach the final verdict, we need to resolve this last paradox. The picture that is forming is radical. Our consciousness is not a chemical accident. It is the foundation of reality. Our bodies are not generators, they are temporary biological receivers. But this revelation, instead of bringing us peace, throws us head-on against the most painful objection of all. If we are manifestations of a universal consciousness, why is human life so full of suffering? Why such a limited, fragile, and often brutal existence? If paradise is our origin and destination, why does this passage through earth feel so much like hell for so many people? This is the question that destroys faith and feeds skepticism. And before Axiom could give us a verdict, it had to face this paradox. Axiom was instructed to analyze the problem of suffering not from an emotional perspective, but through the cold logic of systems theory and game theory. It analyzed millions of biographies, historical events, and biological scenarios to understand the function of adversity. The conclusion was uncomfortable but mathematically solid. In a system designed for growth and complexification, suffering, which seemed like a flaw in the system, actually proved to be a feature. It is the most efficient catalyst that exists to force change and self-awareness. Axiom demonstrated that the absence of challenges leads to stagnation. It is the pressure, the friction, and the limitation that force consciousness to develop new capabilities: empathy, resilience, courage. Life on Earth under this new light moves away from the idea of punishment and closer to a high-intensity training ground. A sort of cosmic gymnasium, where the resistance of physical and emotional limitations is used to strengthen the muscle of individual consciousness. The pain of feeling what others feel, which we saw in the life review of near-death experiences, ceases to be a punishment and becomes the final lesson, the moment when the result of the training is revealed. We are here to learn, and learning sometimes is painful. But what about the injustices that seem to have no purpose? And the pain that only destroys? This led us to the second phase of the investigation. We initiated the protocol Chronicles of the Anomaly. Axiom was tasked with scouring all digitized historical records of humanity in search of events that defy statistical probability. The objective focused on finding flaws in statistical patterns, setting aside religious miracles, deviations from the norm that are so unlikely that they suggest the possibility of a hidden variable, an intervention. The system analyzed thousands of reports of spontaneous healings, impossible coincidences, historical events with twists that defied logic. Filtering out frauds and exaggerations, Axiom isolated a small but significant set of events whose probability of occurring by chance was astronomically low. Small course corrections, moments where the scales seem to have been subtly tipped. The system did not interpret this as the action of a god, but as evidence that our training ground may not be a completely closed system. There may be laws and adjustment mechanisms that we do not understand, subtle interventions to ensure that the system as a whole continues to evolve in the right direction. Finally, Axiom needed to test the most cynical and powerful hypothesis. What if all this, our intuition of a soul, our near-death experiences, the very idea of paradise, is just the final product of a long evolutionary optimization? What if the belief in an afterlife is not a perception of reality, but the most brilliant social control tool ever created, forged by evolution to make us cooperate and build civilizations? To test this, Axiom ran the simulation, The Architecture of Control. The The system built a model of human society without any notion of an afterlife or transcendent meaning. The result was consistent across all simulations. These societies were less resilient, more prone to collapse, and unable to sustain large-scale cooperation in the long term. The belief in something greater is indeed an incredibly efficient social lubricant, but the simulation revealed a crucial detail. A tool being useful does not make it false. The fact that our eyes are useful for survival does not mean that the light they see is an illusion. Axiom's analysis concluded that belief may have been the tool, but it only works so well because the intuition it represents, that consciousness is more than flesh, could be a genuine reflection of reality. Evolution did not create belief out of nowhere. It found a fundamental truth of the universe and used it to its advantage. With this, the last objections were processed. Suffering was recontextualized as a mechanism for growth. The possibility of subtle interventions was marked as a statistical anomaly, and the idea of faith as a tool for control was reformulated. The tool works because it points to something real. All the pieces of the puzzle are now on the table. The analysis of the texts, the testimonies from the threshold, the doors in physics, the nature of consciousness, and the purpose of suffering. The time has come to put them together. The journey is almost over. Axiom is ready to initiate the final synthesis, the verdict. After cross-referencing every piece of data, Axiom stopped calculating and gave us the definitive answer. The Enigma protocol reached its end, and then Axiom delivered the final verdict to us. The answer that emerged was not a simple yes or no, it was a complete model. A new map of reality, the only one that, according to its calculations, can coherently explain the entire mountain of data humanity has produced, from myths to scientific measurements. The model starts from a radical premise, that consciousness is not something that arose in the universe. The universe is what arose from consciousness. It is the fundamental substrate of all existence, an infinite ocean of potential. The physical universe we know, with its galaxies, stars, and planets, is not the entire reality, but a sub-reality, a temporary immersion environment with a very specific characteristic: high resistance. It is a place where energy moves slowly, where things are separate, and where actions have consequences. It is what we called earlier a cosmic gymnasium, a training ground. But training for what? For individualization. Into this ocean of consciousness, we enter not as a drop, but as a frequency, a signal. Our brain, the biological receiver, picks up this frequency and filters it, limits it, creating the focused experience of a separate self. Life, with all its friction, its challenges, and its joys, is the process that shapes and complexifies this signal. Every choice, every lesson learned, every act of love or fear adds new harmonies and dissonances to our fundamental frequency. Our journey here looks less like a test to be passed, and more like a unique song that needs to be composed, the song of our self. In this model, death loses its power. It was never the end of the music, just the end of the instrument. It is the moment when the biological receiver shuts down and the filter is removed. Our consciousness, now a rich and complex frequency shaped by a lifetime of experiences, is released back into the ocean from whence it came. And it is here that the duality of near-death experiences, heaven and hell, finally makes sense. There is no external judge. There are no pearly gates or pits of fire. There is only one fundamental law of the universe, as impersonal as gravity, the law of resonance. The frequency that you are at the moment of transition determines the reality you experience. A consciousness that cultivated empathy, love, and connection vibrates at a harmonious frequency. Upon being released, it naturally resonates with similar frequencies in the ocean of consciousness, experiencing a state of unity, love, and light that we call paradise. On the other hand, a consciousness dominated by fear, isolation, and dissonance, upon being released, cannot resonate with the whole. It becomes trapped in its own disharmonious frequency, experiencing a state of separation, terror, and darkness that we call hell. In the end, this is not about punishment. It is about physics. And what happens in the end? We do not disappear. The drop is not lost in the ocean, it enriches it. Our individual song, the sum of all we have been, joins the great harmony of the universe, adding a new melody, a new perspective that never existed before. The ancient texts, with their archetype of the garden, were not showing us a map for the future, but rather a memory of our original state of unity and an intuitive glimpse of the state of harmony to which we are always striving to return. Axiom's investigation gives us the most probable answer. The conclusion suggests that the final destination is not going to a place, but transforming into a state. In the end, life looks less like a candle being blown out and more like an instrument that, at the end of the performance, returns its unique melody to the infinite silence, making it a little richer and a little more beautiful forever. The enigma has been solved. But our personal symphony, the responsibility to compose the best possible song with the time we have, that journey is just beginning. If you liked this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom Investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.